But we begin with breaking news and what could be the story of the year. A lobster diver nearly eaten alive by, get this, a humpback whale. Sounds like a story from a children's book. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Audrey Assistio. So this happens this morning off the Cape Cod coast, and now that man is telling his tale. So let's go ahead and get right out to NBC 10's Mike Manzoni live in Wellfleet. Mike, obviously this is a very wild story, but how is he doing? Is he okay?
His name is Michael Packard. He lives here in Wellfleet. He got home a couple hours ago. We were there when he arrived home from Cape Cod Hospital, only amazingly with minor injuries. He tells me that he was about 45 feet underwater this morning off the coast of Provincetown, lobster diving, when all of a sudden everything went black around him. He soon realized he was in the mouth of a humpback whale.
Over to sit, honey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Michael Packard came home from the hospital Friday afternoon with one incredible story to tell.
And I just felt this truck hit me, and everything just went dark.
He was lobster diving off the coast of Provincetown when the world around him suddenly blacked out.
I just thought, did I just get eaten by a white shark? And then I said, no, I don't feel any teeth. And I said, oh my God, I'm in the mouth of a whale with his mouth shut.
Seconds later, he realized he was in serious trouble. To make things even worse, he couldn't find the regulator for his oxygen tank, and he had no way to escape.
Am I just gonna, like, run out of air and suffocate? Is he gonna swallow me?
That's when he thought about his family.
And I'm like, this is how you're gonna go, Michael. This is how you're gonna die, in the mouth of a whale.
His son Jacob was in school at the time and got a text from his mother.
Yeah, your dad was diving and a whale just, I don't know, attacked him, ate him.
The humpback whale eventually spit him out after about 30 or 40 seconds.
And I just got thrown out of his mouth into the water. There was just white water everywhere. And I just was laying on the surface floating.
That doesn't seem like a long time, but try telling that to someone who almost became a whale's hot lunch.
I have a dislocated knee and just a lot of soft tissue damage in my legs. I also was scared that I had maybe a diving injury from coming up too fast or an embolism. But everything's good. The doctor says I'm good.
It's it's an interesting story. My only quibble, it's an amazing story. This happened just a few weeks ago, by the way, if you didn't catch it in the news, back in June. My only quibble is, did you catch the introduction? The lady says, it sounds like a story from a children's book. I guess she forgot her Sunday school lessons because being swallowed by a whale actually sounds like a story from the Bible about a big fish who swallowed a man whole and then spit him up on dry land. And he wasn't a lobster diver. He was actually a prophet called by God. And his name was, you know all this, Jonah. But the story of Jonah is actually not about how he survived the ordeal of being swallowed by a fish. I know that's what we kind of focus on even as adults. That's what we think of. If I said Jonah, you would think, yes, Jonah and the whale. And that's often the title that's put on children's books and even maybe some sermon titles. But that's a misleading title, let me suggest to you, of what actually the biblical book of Jonah is about. Not only is the fish, here's your Bible trivia for you, the fish in the book of Jonah is not identified as a whale, okay? It's just called a great fish. But also, and this is the key, the fish is only mentioned in 3 verses out of 4 chapters in the whole book. And so let me just say this morning that as we look at the story of Jonah, begin to look at the story of Jonah, that the story of Jonah is not a fish story. And what is startling and surprising about Jonah's story is actually heard in the very first verses of the book that bears his name. And this is how Jonah, the book of Jonah, begins. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. And after paying the fare, he went aboard and he sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. This is remarkable because nowhere else in the entire Bible do we have any record of a prophet who's called by God who actually disobeys God's call, like Jonah does. Now, there are some, like Isaiah, for example, who at first feel unqualified by God's calling. There are others, like Jeremiah, who agonize over what they have to announce. But the usual response to God's call is kind of like what you read in the book of Amos. And Amos says, "The Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy?" Or, "Here I am, Lord, send me." And so when it comes to prophets, Jonah is an anomaly. But even before Jonah runs away from God's call, there are hints that this is a prophetic account unlike any others that we have heard before. First of all is the fact that God calls Jonah to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach. Now, that is shocking. We may not understand that, sitting here in Gravelburg this morning, but that's shocking because, first of all, it's a call for a Hebrew prophet to leave Israel and to go to a non-Israelite, non-Jewish city. And Jonah's mission is unprecedented in that way because up until this point, prophets of God have never been sent to a foreign nation. All the prophets have been sent to God's people, to Israel. And God is calling Jonah not only to a foreign nation, and not only to just any foreign nation. The God of Israel is calling Jonah to warn Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of the powerful and great Assyrian Empire. And he's to warn Nineveh, the capital of this powerful empire, that God's judgment is coming. Now you need to understand that Assyria was one of the cruelest and most violent empires in ancient times. The kings of Assyria often boasted of littering the plains with the corpses of those they had conquered, of burning cities completely to the ground. Someone has called Assyria an ancient terrorist state. And Assyria had invaded and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital Samaria in 722 BC. And this nation, this terrorist nation, this nation that had destroyed the northern kingdom, this was the nation that was the focus of God's missionary outreach. That's surprising. And so Jonah does the exact opposite of what God tells him to do. God calls Jonah to go east, and Jonah goes west. He's directed to travel overland, and he heads for the coast. He is sent to the big city, and he buys a one-way ticket to the end of the world, if you can see where Tarshish may have been, modern-day Spain, rocks of Gibraltar maybe. Why does Jonah do this? Why does he refuse God's call? Why does he run? Jonah doesn't tell us why yet, although in a couple of chapters we're going to hear directly from him. But at this point, we don't know why he decides to do what he does. But maybe we can make a few guesses based on the information we have at this point. Maybe Jonah refuses and runs because the mission that God is calling him to doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense practically. It doesn't make sense theologically. From the practical side of things, there was little likelihood that a military and cultural superpower like Assyria, like Nineveh, is going to listen to someone like, who are you again? Jonah? Jonah who? And Jonah also would have said, not only does this not practically make sense, this doesn't theologically make sense because several years earlier, the prophet Nahum had prophesied that God was going to destroy Nineveh for its evil. And so everyone knows that God has said that Nineveh is on a collision course and its destiny is already determined. So why do I have to go to Nineveh? They're not going to listen to me anyways, but why do I have to go and tell them something that's already been said? So why is God calling Jonah? Wouldn't a successful mission to Nineveh only make a mockery of God's own promises to Israel? Wouldn't it prove Nahum to be a false prophet? What explanation could there be of this assignment that God is giving to Jonah? And so Jonah has a problem. He has a problem with the job that he's been assigned to. But Jonah has a bigger problem here, and I want to suggest the bigger problem is this, and it's a problem with God. Specifically, Jonah here has a problem with God's goodness, with God's wisdom, with the justice of God. Maybe we're like that too. Maybe we have problems with God at times. We sit in the doctor's office and we're stunned by the diagnosis. We lose hope of ever finding a decent job. We wonder what has happened to the relationship that we've always wanted. And when this happens, we need to decide, does God know what is best? Or do I? And the default mode of my heart, and the default mode, I may suggest, of your heart, is probably that I know what is best. And I make the decision about what I'm going to do. And so we doubt that God is good. We doubt that God is committed to our happiness. And if we can't see any good reason for something that God says, if we can't come up with any explanation that makes sense for what God is doing, then we assume, well, there can't be any good explanation. There can't be any good reason for what is happening here. I think that's what Jonah concludes. He can't think of any reason for God's command. So there can't be a reason to do what God is calling him to do, so he starts running. And so Jonah runs, and he's trying to run from the presence of God. And so we get this, what initially, and if you can imagine for a moment, and for some of you this may be true, this is the first time that you're reading or hearing the story of Jonah. And so you begin reading this or hearing this story, and you think we're going to get a prophetic book, a story about a prophet of God, and it quickly becomes an adventure story on the high seas. And the sea story begins with God generating a storm of epic proportions. He sends this great wind on the sea. God is not going to allow Jonah to frustrate his will, but God's wind-hurling action, and that's actually the imagery that's used, God hurls this wind, is not going to just impact Jonah, it's also going to impact the non-Israelite sailors that are aboard the ship that Jonah is on, trying to get away from God. And this storm, this huge storm of epic proportions, prompts the sailors to undertake a series of actions described in terms that suggest that they're kind of like a ritual, maybe a little religious, rather than nautically speaking. There's no practical reason for them to do what they do. And so each one, as we read here, each one cries out to his God, and they toss cargo overboard to lighten the weight of the ship, or maybe they're trying to pacify, make an offering to the storm gods, the gods of the sea. And where's Jonah? Jonah's gone down below deck. He's lying down. He is in a deep snoring sleep. Now, some of you know people who could do that. But Jonah's sleep is interrupted by a voice as the captain yells, "What's with you sleeping? Cry out to your God." And he adds, perhaps the God will give us a thought and we won't die. And the irony for Jonah is that he believes that it is by escaping God, by getting away from God, that he is going to live. The sailors, however, see things differently. And they devise another strategy to quiet this raging storm. And instead of each calling out to his God, they say to each other, "Come on, let's cast lots." And so they cast lots, which was not an uncommon, it was actually a common practice in the ancient world to determine the source of the distress that they're experiencing. And the lot falls on Jonah. And it foreshadows his fate. The lot falls on Jonah. And it isn't long until the sailors figure out that Jonah's God, together with what Jonah has done, has set all of this in motion. And so they ask him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down, to make the sea quiet down?" Now they know that God has brought this situation on them because of what Jonah has done. And so they are looking for a Jonah-focused solution. Jonah tells them, "Lift him up, lift me up, toss me, hurl me," by the way. God hurls the storm. "Hurl me into the sea. If you toss me overboard, The sea will become calm. It didn't work when you tossed the cargo overboard, but if you toss me overboard, the sea will become calm. There's a little bit of humor and irony in this story too. And so toss me overboard, and something that the tossing the cargo overboard didn't accomplish will happen. Well, the sailors actually ignore Jonah's command to toss him over, and they start rowing, furiously rowing towards dry ground. But the not so invisible hand on the dial, that is controlling the storm's volume, turns it up another notch. And for the first time, the sailors call out to the Lord. And their petition is, don't let us die because of this man's life. Don't impose innocent blood on us. And now they're ready to toss Jonah overboard. They do it, and the raging storm suddenly subsides. But notice when the sea grows calm, the sailors' fear increases, and they offer a sacrifice. Their fear is not of the storm anymore. Now it is fear of the Lord. There's irony, isn't there? In this depiction, we have these non-Israelite sailors, we might say these pagan sailors, who are fearing the Lord, while Jonah is refusing to act on his fear of God in an appropriate way. The sailors are demonstrating true reverence and obedience for God. As soon as Jonah hits the water, the God whom he did not trust saves him. And this is the mysterious divine mercy of God. This is God's grace and mercy that Jonah finds offensive. This is God's mercy and grace that Jonah finds so inexplicable. And it turns out to be what saves him, to be his only hope. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. He's swallowed by a great fish. Now, the unbelievable part of this story is not what you're thinking. A man swallowed by a great fish. Let me suggest to you, as I've already said, that this isn't the focus of this story. As remarkable, although this gentleman from Cape Cod can tell us a few things about it. But the shocker in this story is that Jonah, the renegade prophet who did not deserve God's gracious kindness, receives it. Isn't that the shocking story of your life and mine? That I, who did not deserve God's gracious kindness, received it. That's a story for God's people in all times, even in Jonah's day. We've always been products, always been recipients, beneficiaries of God's grace. And the people of ancient Israel were called and sustained by God's grace, God's unmerited favor, because of God's loyal love. And that is certainly true of Jonah, the son of Amittai, who's called by God to do his work. And it's certainly true of Darrell Buchanan, the son of Benjamin. Even when Jonah flatly disobeys the call of God on his life, even when he refuses to extend God's love and mercy and grace to his enemies, even then, God refuses to give Jonah what you and I would think he deserves. Instead, the God who refuses to give up on Nineveh, that symbol of a powerful, evil, terrorist-like nation, the God who refuses to give up on Nineveh refuses to give up on Jonah, refuses to give up on you and me. And he pursues Jonah into the depths of the sea and into the belly of this great fish. And for those of us who are too often like Jonah, let me say this afternoon that this is powerfully good news. That the one who died for us while we were still sinners, while we were still God's enemies, continues to pursue us. He pursues us with his grace again and again and again and again. And this week, bask in that, revel in that, and respond to it.